Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches English Language. This video is going to focus on the Edexcel English Language 2.0 paper. So it's the second version, not the original. It's the beginning of a series of videos that's going to break down the papers into sections. So this one is only looking at paper 1, section A, questions 1 to 3. I'm going to use the June 2023 past paper, and there's a little link to it in the comments. So what I would do is I would download the paper so that you can read the extract through, because I'm literally just going to get straight away stuck in to question 1. I'm going to give you some tips and some advice, and I'm going to show you some model answers and talk you through how to approach those particular questions. So for now, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to start off with question 1, which is a straight information retrieval, just looking at implicit and explicit ideas. So they ask you to identify 4 things from the text. That's the first thing to be aware of. But it's really important that you read that question carefully to make sure that you know exactly what they want. So in this case, we're identifying 4 things the bicycle riders did during the race. So that's not about how they felt or what was going on in the crowd, what they actually did. So we're looking for actions, okay? Now, if we have a little look at the text, nice short one for section A, you know that you've got options across the whole shebang, okay? And there'll be multiple answers. So we come out of the exam and someone goes, oh, did you write this down? And you're like, no, don't worry. As long as you're answering the exact question, you're golden. So just think about it carefully. So for example, we could have something about the fact that the riders have a lot of energy, like they use a lot of energy. That's something they're doing. That they sprint. That they have to move out from the bunch, that they carry sponges. You know, those are sort of 4 things that you could say that they do during the race, because it's overt. And so, for example, all you need to actually do for this question is just write those things. So use more energy, sprint, move out from the bunch, carry sponges. They're all actions, okay? Do be careful, watch out for irrelevant details and just wasting time writing too much. Sometimes if you write a lot, you might actually write yourself out of a mark because you might include things that are irrelevant. Don't put the same point more than once, because for example, in that little extract, you actually, it referenced sprinting twice, and so if you used it twice, you'd only get 1 mark. And make sure you say 4 things, you know, just keep on looking until you find the 4th. So that's how, like, that's the question that warms up our brain somewhat. And then we get to something slightly harder, which is our evaluation question. Okay, so in lines 2 to 10, the writer tries to make watching the bicycle race seem exciting and entertaining. So always with the evaluation question, check the actual subject, okay? So it's not that the bicycle racing was exciting, it's watching the bicycle race is exciting and entertaining. That's what we're evaluating, how that experience of watching is presented as exciting and entertaining. And we're going to evaluate how successfully this has achieved. So we're going to talk in a moment about what we mean by evaluate, because it's different to analyze. And the other thing to be aware of is that they're asking for 3 distinct views, okay, 3, which means that you need 3 different examples. Now, it specifically gives you lines 2 to 10, which I've just cut out for you here to have a quick squiz through. They will not credit anything that comes from outside. So if you start writing on that first sentence about it being the largest, no, you're not going to get that, okay? So make sure, I know it sounds daft, I know it sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised at how many students just make the mistake of not reading it carefully enough. But before we look at how we answer, we need to have a little think about what this means, like what it is to evaluate. So, definition. When you evaluate, you're making a judgment about a text. You're looking at how well it works. You're looking at its successes. You're looking at its weaknesses. Now, this comes with a slight word of warning. I'm not saying that you can't say it's unsuccessful, but generally these are well-written pieces of writing. They're normally pretty successful texts. So if you're being asked to evaluate how exciting something is, and you go, I find this really boring, you know, that's not going to get you anywhere. So what you've got to do, if you think something is unsuccessful, you've got to make sure that your reasons are really justified and linked to the actual content. And I'm going to give you an example of that in my model. So I'm going to model for you something that demonstrates something not quite working. But it would not surprise me if you end up with more successes than, you know, failures, not failures, but you mean less successful kind of attempts, if that makes sense. Okay, so how are we to kind of get the ideas? This is not an analysis question. That's not to say that you can't make reference to a metaphor or an adjective, but only if it forms part of your judgment. So it has to be attached to a judgment. So that means that you're really focusing on the content. And one way of doing that is to use an acronym, something like PEST. This isn't exhaustive. This doesn't cover everything that you might want to evaluate. But if you think something like PEST, you think to yourself, well, how are the people behaving? What events are being described? What's the setting like? And is there anything that I notice about the tone? Is it kind of a tone of excitement or chaos or panic? This is kind of getting you into the content, the actual what is happening, what is the meaning, rather than, oh, they've used a metaphor. Okay, and you're going to see that again in a moment when I show you the model. So that's how you might generate ideas. Like, so the question that we're looking at is like whether or not watching it is exciting. So how are the people in the crowd reacting? If they're acting excited, according to the reader, then obviously that's quite successful. If the event is being described in a way, the actual race itself, is super exciting or unpredictable, then obviously it's very successful. You see what I mean? Okay, and then how do we signpost to the examiner that we're being evaluative? Now this is easy. You just have to make sure you use some evaluative adverbs and adjectives in your paragraphs, okay? So we use the acronym PECS, which basically stands for powerful, effective, compelling, and successful. You can use them as adverbs by putting an ly at the end. Powerfully, he creates an effective blah, 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 blah. This is a very powerful moment because blah, 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 blah. These are all signposting to your examiner that you are evaluating. So now what we're going to do is we're going to see it in action. First of all, we need to find some useful content, again, using our PEST acronym if it is relevant. So we've got our section here. It seems that the greater the crowd, the more energy is displayed by the riders. So straight away, I'm bringing that in because we've got the actions of the riders for people, but we've also got a feeling of the setting, like it's full, it's bustling, it's a bigger and bigger crowd. So that makes it sound quite exciting, the fact that there are lots of people there. You keep reading. It was a case of sprinting all the time. Again, that action of the event sounds interesting, but I'm probably going to pick out the next bit. First one and then another would move out from the bunch, followed immediately by some rider who suddenly awoke to the situation that it was a case of speed up or fall hopelessly behind. So again, that makes it sound very gripping. You never know who is coming out on top because they keep changing places. That makes it sound exciting. And then I would also maybe pick something down from the bottom. So I've picked up this idea about all of the smoke, the fact that they're carrying sponges to prevent the swallowing of smoke, with which the garden was well filled. It was so dense at times that the riders were hardly discernible from one side of the track to the other. Okay, that doesn't make it sound exciting, does it? It makes it sound kind of gross. But you know, it's inhibiting the people from actually being able to watch the race. So I might say that the writer here isn't as effective in demonstrating how exciting the race is because it sounds difficult to see. So I found my info. I know I've got 2 underlines, but I'm counting this as one. I'll bring those quotes together, okay? So now let's have a little look at a model, how it should look on the page. So the writer successfully depicts the excitement of watching the race through the description of the crowds. He writes that the greater the crowd, the more energy is displayed by the riders. This is effective because the comparative adjective greater makes the crowd seem busy and bustling. This excitement is then emphasized by the reactions of the riders who seem to feed off the energy of the crowd. Okay, so what I've done there is I've used a topic sentence that includes an evaluative adverb in this case. So my topic sentence is offering a judgment. That's really important, okay? Then I get my quote in, right? And then notice I use an evaluative adjective here. This is where I am justifying my evaluation. I'm explaining why it's effective. Now, on this occasion, I do make reference to some language, yeah, but it's part of my judgment and it's part of my justification, so it's valid. It's not just sat there on its own. Okay, let's keep going. Furthermore, the presentation of the competitiveness, of the riders is particularly compelling. He describes how first one and then another would move out from the bunch and they would be followed immediately by another rider. This is very successful in making the event seem exciting, as it suggests the audience would not be able to predict who will win the race. So it's keep them on the edge of their seats. Now, do you notice here that my topic sentence, as well as using an evaluative adjective, it's different to the first one, and it's focused on content, description of the crowds, competitiveness of the riders. I'm really struggling with that word today. So this is something to do with people and setting. This is to do with the riders themselves. But it keeps it interesting. If you have the same sentence starter, you know, the writer is successful in making watching the bicycle race seem exciting because, it's difficult to read for the examiner, and you want to put them in a good mood. And then finally, here is my paragraph where I'm suggesting something isn't as effective. However, a moment that is not quite as effective is his description of the smoke, which was so dense that it rendered the riders hardly discernible and well filled the area. Notice how I'm just embedding little quotes in there rather than putting the full shebang in. This is less successful as it suggests that the riders and therefore the race itself would be hard to see, making it sound less entertaining. Okay, 3 points, clearly evaluative, with justification of those judgments. Okay, that's what we're aiming for. Let's now move on to question 3, slightly higher in marks. The last one was a 6 marker, this one is an 8 marker. So question 3 is AO2 and it is all about language analysis. So how does the writer use language, obviously, to interest and inform the reader? You should include the writer's use of language and the effect on the reader. That is the most important bit. Use examples from the whole text and relevant subject terminology. Okay, so they do want you using the precise terms within your analysis of your quotations. So that's super important as well. So let's talk about what kind of terms we might want to use. So you got the biggies: metaphor, simile, personification. Yeah, your bread and butter. Hyperbole, that's a fancy way of saying exaggeration. By the way, this is not specific to the extract we're looking at, but just broad language labels that you might want to use. Alliteration, and the most kind of common alliteration that you might talk about is like sibilance, which is the repeated S sounds. But if you didn't know that word and you just wanted to say alliteration, that's absolutely fine. Onomatopoeia, words sound like their meanings. And then if you're looking at a text and you think to yourself, well, there just aren't that many devices, like I can't see any metaphors or similes, but there are some very well chosen and effective words, and you might look at simply the connotations and associations of the word choices. Might be that it's emotive language, but the single word analysis technique is always a goodie. Now, for subject terminology, you do want to try and identify the word class, whether it's a noun, a verb, an adjective, an adverb, a pronoun, whatever it might be. But do maybe brush up on this, because in the examiner's report, they did comment on students getting confused between adjectives and adverbs. So you do want to make sure you're accurate. But this is super important, and it goes back to the bullet points on the previous slide on the question. Devices are only useful if you can say what the effect on the reader is, what the impact is. If you just feature spot, yeah, so if you just go, this is a metaphor, full stop, you're not going to get any marks for it. You've got to be able to say why. So if you're getting stuck, think, What are the connotations of that word or that image? What does it make me think of? What do we associate with it? Is there kind of colour symbolism, something like that? And that will get you through. So you can use the phrase, the noun such and such has connotations of such and such, which will make the reader think of such and such, increasing their enjoyment, if that makes sense. Okay. Now we need to think about finding our examples. So we've got the full extract here. I'm not going to read it out to you again, but I'm just going to show you the bits that I would probably have a little look at. So I'd look at the opening, and I'd think about, you know, the largest over in the garden at any sporting event. So it makes it sound like the biggest and the best, mainly because of the superlative adjective, largest. Superlative adjectives are when you put the est at the end. I might also look at this little metaphor of the rider who suddenly awakes to the situation, that it's a case of having to speed up or fall hopelessly behind, because that suggests that, you know, like every second counts. That makes it sound really interesting, because it suggests that if a rider kind of like pauses for a moment, like that could be his place in the competition gone forever. I've also highlighted this little bit in terms, because remember it's interest and inform as well. So this makes it sound quite frightening, actually, quite dangerous for the riders, because it's suggesting that there's a normality about falling throughout the day. Such a long old race, but the way that he continues through. Now there are other things that you could have commented on. So for example, this little bit about the smoke, which we talked about in the evaluation, would really be good. This little moment about the breathing spell, you could do that. There's loads you could comment on. These are just the ones that I'm going to work with for the sake of my model response. Okay, so here we go. The writer interests the reader through informing them of the scale and grandeur of the event. He describes that the crowd was the largest over in the garden at any sporting event. His use of the superlative adjective largest makes the event seem impressive on a scale never witnessed before. This is emphasised through the phrase any sporting event, suggesting that the race is drawn in extraordinary numbers, more than any other competition. He also makes the race itself seem unpredictable and exciting through the riders who suddenly awoke to the situation of having to speed up or fall hopelessly behind. The initial metaphor of waking up makes the race sound high pressure, that any lapse in concentration could result in disaster, and the adverb suddenly informs the reader of how quickly a mistake can occur. This pressure and tension is amplified through the phrase fall hopelessly behind, suggesting the stakes are high. The adverb hopelessly conveying that once you have lost your position, it is very difficult to recover. Furthermore, the writer interests us through the depiction of the danger of the race. He describes falling down as customary, the adjective noting that tumbles are expected. However, he also hints that this is normal, particularly as Glick continues as though it were part of the programme, suggesting that the riders are resilient and keep going. Okay, so all of my topic sentences, you'll notice, are still content-based, and I have not used the phrase uses language to interest and inform the reader. Now you can, if you feel safe, by starting that way, but actually I think a better response demonstrates understanding and interpretation from word go. If every paragraph begins, the writer uses language to interest and inform the reader through, quote, you're not giving your view, you're not actually giving your answer, you're just kind of like piggybacking into the quote so that you can then do your analysis. And then in the final part of each of my paragraphs, you'll notice that I straight away, as soon as I've got my quote in, the first thing I do is reference either a device here or like a word class. Yeah, so straight away, quote is in, focus straight in on device or particular word. And as I said before, the impact and the effect on the reader. That is the most important way to get your 8 marks. Okay, that's it for now. Obviously, that was only questions 1 to 3. We've got a lot more to do because next video I will do the second text. Okay, so look out for that. I'll try and get it out as quickly as I can because I know that paper 1 is fast approaching. Hope the revision is going well. Happy revising.